So I think there are two interrelated issues which are pretty tricky, which are going to be big, challenging for us. One is we are a high-tech country, but because we're a high-tech country, we are automating very early in our economic development process, right? We're the 140th poorest country in the world. And yet, as I mentioned, you visit our airports, they're incredibly high-tech, right? So we need to create jobs for people, but because technology is so cheap, and we have so many clever people deploying technology, our banking system, our IT services industry, our hospitality industry is automating using AI. Factories are getting robotized. And I worry about that. I worry about the fact that because technology is so easily available, we're basically moving, we're getting rid of people and automating very early in our development. So for example, the Indian IT services industry is the world's largest, right? But it shed 100,000 people in the last 12 months, right? Because the IT services companies are saying we'll shift to AI and make more money, right? We'll do the same amount of work, but with fewer people. So this is a challenge. And then the broader issue, right? Our workforce is 500 million people. At the moment, we only have 200 million. And if you're very sort of charitable and say you're in a position of power, you'll say 300 million jobs. We have somewhere between 200 to 300 million people, primarily in northern and eastern India, young people with no jobs, no skills. Now, the current solution, the sort of political fudge, is to give these people doles, right? So you give them food subsidies, you give them a national employment guarantee, you give them subsidized health insurance, and because the country is growing at 8% and tax collection is growing at 14%, roughly $80 billion bill, the country has an $80 billion bill to look after these unemployed people. So financially it's doable, but there is a human cost. And as the rest of the country gets richer, and on social media, the youngsters can see, unemployed youngsters can see how the rest of the country is pulling away, I worry about social problems. So it's a linked issue. One is lack of skilling, and the other is the rise of low-cost automation. And people like us who live there, we're sort of urging the government to use AI, use robotization to create jobs rather than to get rid of jobs. But I think it's a very tough policy issue which is yet to be resolved. If I was kind to India, I would say I don't think any country has resolved it, this whole mechanization and automation of jobs. But no other country has 200, 300 million people waiting to be employed. This is the core of our challenge.
I mean, it's interesting. If you just cursory sort of look at economic history, actually India follows a development model that we've never seen before. Normally you go from agriculture, from the primary sector to manufacturing, and then you go from manufacturing to the service sector. And India skipped that bit. Right? I mean, there is really, no manufacturing business. In fact, that's at the macroeconomic level, as you know very well, your balance of payments, is constantly in deficit or in threat of being in deficit, right? Because so much of what is called white goods and brown goods, right? A lot of it actually has to be imported. Let me sort of skip a little bit into, so then why is there no large-scale manufacturing, right? If you ask the people, I'd love to ask you, why is that the case? The answer I get is because the infrastructure doesn't work. Because physical supply of various components, what the Japanese have mastered, the just-in-time inventory system, in India basically is impossible because, for all intents and purposes, neither the roads nor the ports work.
Yeah, so again, if it's worth stepping back, we are the only country on the history of this planet, the only country to become a democracy way before we became rich. So at independence, we were a universal adult suffrage, right? 1947, we were born a democratic country. Now what that does, and there are broadly three reasons to why we struggle to compete, is our minimum wages are pretty high for a low-income country. We're the 140th poorest nation in the world, but our minimum wages are 3x that of Bangladesh. Right? So most of the shirts we wear in India, are made in Bangladesh because the labor there is 1/3 the cost and operates in conditions which in India will not be acceptable because in India worker rights are far better developed because it's a universal adult suffrage franchise, right? So the first issue is your worker rights are high, so your minimum wages are high. Second, because to build rapid infrastructure development, you need to go over farmlands, right? We are one of the most fertile countries in the world, and the farmers are saying, why should I give up my farmland unless the government gives me a massive handout? Right? Getting farmland has historically been tough. That being said, in the last 10 years, we have doubled the highway network. In the last 20 years, we've tripled the highway network. But compared to, say, a China, it's hard to go and, when you forget farmland, even in cities, it's hard to slam a metro through the city because people will say, you dare destroy our house, we'll vote against you, right? So being a democracy at a low income stage, no other countries had to deal with it. So second is infrastructure build out has been tough. And third is historically, cost of capital has been high. So even today, an SME in India, I told you 10% is the cost of working capital finance for an SME. Working capital finance, I think in China is 2 or 3%. Right? So yes, China's wages are high, but say Vietnam's wages are lower than India. I don't know land prices in Vietnam, but I suspect land prices in Vietnam will be cheaper. And I suspect the cost of working capital will be lower in Vietnam. And hence, anything which is labor intensive or capital intensive manufacturing, we can't compete. Neither labor intensive nor capital intensive. Our sweet spot is manufacturing like pharmaceuticals, which is basically intellectual property slammed into a tablet. IT services obviously is brains. So anything which requires brains, we can cut it, right? But that's good for the elite. But what do you do for workers who are, school graduates or not even that? Basically, workers who have basic level of rudimentary skills, how do you employ them without mass manufacturing? But how do you get mass manufacturing if your cost of working capital is 2x, 3x that of Vietnam, and your land costs are higher than Vietnam and your labor costs are higher? So the government's launched something which has worked for mobile phones. It's called production linked incentive. So Apple, for instance, gets a PLI. So I think it's 2% of the value of the phones that they make. Apple gets a subsidy of 2% of the value of the phones. That lowers the cost gap between India and Vietnam. So it's worked for them in phones. It's the production linked incentives actually have been very successful in mobile phones. It's not yet been successful in things like shoes, clothes, but that's something they're trying to crack. My suggestion to them would be, to our government, and we've written about it, is lower the corporate tax rate from 25% to 20%. America is 15. I think China is 20. If we lower the corporate tax rate from 25 to 20, I think we'll be able to close some of the cost gap between us and Southeast Asia. It's not relevant in things like global capability centers because we're in a class of one there. There's no other country which produces 10 million graduates a year. India produces 10 million graduates a year. No other country can match us. But for employing large numbers in factories, there's a lot of work to be done.
Does India do sort of, China's rise, a lot of focus on sort of special economic zones, and, as a result of that preferential tax rate, does India operate like that, or is it really pinpoint?
So we did a version of special economic zones for IT services. Those were spectacularly successful. In fact, they were so successful that we no longer need special economic zones for IT services. We've done special economic zones for manufacturing, but they've not been as successful. So giving tax exemption has not been as successful. So this latest strategy is the production linked incentive, which has worked really, really well in mobile phones. And I think our next union budget is on 23rd July. I suspect we will get a expansion of the production linked incentives, where if you make $100 worth of stuff, you get a $2 payment from the government to basically bridge the fact that our factor costs are very high for what is still a very poor country.
Right. It's very interesting. Rise of global capability centers there. I don't think that there is a Japanese company in there.
I think I thought I saw Rakuten in there.
Rakuten is politely what? MUFG. Okay. Well. Okay. Okay.
No, so I live in a suburb of Mumbai. So Nomura's GCC is 100 meters from my house, and we've actually we benefited from hiring from Nomura's GCC. They're very good people who work there, and our head of IT came from Nomura's Global Capability Center, right? So this aspect I think will be in a class of our own. If you ask me, in GCC, in making knowledge-intensive manufactured products like electronics and like pharmaceuticals, we'll pull away, right? But can we make fans and jackets and sports shoes. I think you guys know the answer. We'll have to come back a couple of years hence if we're going to prove you wrong on that. So far, it's been tough for us to make those basic things that sort of propel China and Vietnam's rise, or even Bangladesh's rise. Bangladesh exports more textiles than India, right? It's a country 1/30th our size, and they export more textiles than India because their minimum wages are 1/3 that of India's.